volume up, please?
Yeah.
While she's doing that, let me,
No, I don't think it might.
got it up, Annie Maria? How's it? I can hear myself now. Good? How's that?
That's better.
Okay? In the back? All right, everybody's happy. All right, if you know anything at all about Mexican history, you gotta agree with me, it's an absolutely fascinating subject. They've been, I mean, it's been just an amazing subject. And about 4 or 5 years ago, I put together a seminar for the audit groups, SAGE, and it was 6 lectures of an hour apiece. And I thought there's absolutely no way we're gonna handle that at Westminster. So I got it down to 2 lectures. And tonight's the first one, and we're gonna start at the very beginning, and we're gonna work our way all the way to around 1810. And that's primarily Spanish colonial Mexico. You can see the early civilization, the Spaniards come, discovery and conquest, the New Spain period. That's the end of today. And then we'll come in about 2 weeks and we'll do part 2, which will bring us beginning with the Mexican Revolution and get up to about 1900. So let's get started. The humans have been in Mexico for about 22,000 years, roughly, and they got civilized because they developed corn. Now, corn, the original name for corn was like maize, and that's a word from the Taino Indians who lived in the Dominican Republic, which was the first place the Spaniards encountered it. So when Columbus came over and he landed there, he found this new stuff called corn or maize, and that's where the name came from. You can see the picture of the grass, teosinte grass. That's where corn came from. And you can see the first kernel, the first cob of corn is a little bigger than a quarter. And the early Mexicans, going back about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, figured out how to domesticate that corn and pick out very carefully the right kind of kernels to make the cobs grow bigger and bigger. And they went from that quarter-sized cob to today's corn. And that's a big deal. It was domesticated about the same time that wheat was back in the Middle East. It's an amazing achievement on the part of Mexicans here. The civilizations came because of corn, and that allowed people to settle down and begin what we call civilization. There were three different periods of time that were dominated by 3 particular groups of Native Americans that defined this period. The OLMECS were the first ones, and then a little later on came the Mayans, and then most recently were the Aztecs, who were here when the Spaniards came around. So the OLMECS started 5,000 or 6,000 years ago to settle down. They're called the mother culture of Mexico. You can see where they were located in that little bend of on the Gulf of Mexico, just before you get to the Yucatan Peninsula. The Olmec civilization was at its peak about the same time as was ancient Greece. The Olmecs did a bunch of things that are pretty interesting. They are credited with being the first people in the world to introduce the concept of zero in their mathematics. So they had that. They developed a very accurate calendar over 3,000 years ago. They carved these stone heads. That's a picture. There's several of them. Some of them are like 10 or 12 feet tall. They're really huge, these stone heads. And they played a ball game, which they invented several thousand years ago. And it's the first human team sport. They started it about 1700 BC. It was played continuously throughout Mexico, Guatemala, all of Mesoamerica, up until the time that the Spaniards came. They had elaborate stadiums for this game. The picture that you see there on the bottom is the one that has survived, and it's at Monte Alban, which is in western Mexico. The court was shaped like an eye. These are some Aztec drawings of the ball game. So this was a game that you couldn't use your hands. You had to bump it with your elbows or your knees or something, and you had to try to make the rubber ball go through that hole up there. So it was the first human team sport. The classical era, about roughly 2,000 years ago to 1,000 years ago, was where we saw the rise and fall of the cities in Mexico. Religion was the main thing that dominated them. The priests ruled everything. They had lots of gods for the sun, the moon, rain, water, fire, and a bunch of other things. But the most famous god they had was one we call the feathered serpent. The Mayans called it Cuculcán, and the Aztecs called it Quetzalcoatl. It's the same god, it's a feathered serpent, and it played a very important role throughout this whole history. Now, the Mayans have been around for a long time. Their civilization was roughly 1,000 to 2,000 years ago. They're still here today, all over Mexico and the highlands and in Guatemala, so we still have a very strong Mayan component left today. They developed a writing system which was completely legible. We figured out how to read it. And they chipped it in their stone and drew it in pictures. So we have a lot of information that they left us that we can read from their writing, which is how we know a lot about the Mayans today. They were also well known for their art, for their architecture, all those huge buildings that they built. They were excellent in astronomy and a few other things. They were really a pretty amazing group. But the civilization itself collapsed about 1,000 years ago. In the 9th century, all the big cities were just abandoned. They didn't build any more monuments, no more buildings. They didn't put any more dates on things. It just kind of stopped. Now, people stayed here, but their civilization died out. And there's all kinds of theories about why that might have happened. The usual suspects: foreign invasion, peasant revolt, trade, disease, ecological collapse, maybe a combination of all those. But they had this civilization collapse about 1,000 years ago. And then came the Aztecs. These were the ones that were here when Cortez arrived, when the Spaniards arrived. They called themselves Mexica, and they came from basically Arizona in northern Mexico. That was their homeland. They called it Aztlan, and their language, which still exists today, Nahuatl, is a close cousin to Utes, Shoshone, and Comanche in the United States. That's their old derivation. Their legend says that they started their migration from Arizona about 1064. And it took them, 200 and some odd years. They finally made it to what we now know as Mexico City, where they stopped and settled. They were the outsiders at that time. They were shunned by the locals. They were forced to live on an island because nobody else wanted the island, so they kind of gave it to them. They revered the earlier cultures that they had. They adopted this god, Quetzalcoatl, and it didn't take them but about 150 years, and they ended up dominating everything. Now, there's an interesting story about why they ended up where they did. You'll recognize this symbol of Mexico here. When they left Arizona, their war god, which was a guy named Huitzilopochtli, he said, "I want you to go south and keep going until you see an eagle with a snake in his mouth perched on top of a cactus. And when you find that, that's where you're supposed to stay." And so they found it in 1325. They arrived at Mexico City and they saw this eagle, and so that's where they stayed. Now, the rest of their flag came in 1821 when they got their independence from Spain. They developed their own flag. They put that symbol on there, their foundation symbol, and they had 3 colors, which they called the 3 guarantees in 1821. One of them was I guarantee you that nobody but Catholics are gonna live in Mexico. The other guarantee was we're gonna keep you independent from Spain, and we're gonna stay united against all of our enemies. So those were the three guarantees that represent the three colors that are in the Mexican flag. Now here's the Aztec Empire as it existed when Cortez arrived. You can see that there was this main area around, the town's name then was Tenochtitlan, that's Mexico City today. You can see that they had a core state around there. They also had some allies, but as you can see, they had several groups that were not yet subjected by the Aztecs. And that fact plays an important play in the conquest of Mexico. Now, the first time the Spaniards wanted to come here was in 1517. They sent 3 ships out of Cuba with 110 men. They came to Yucatan. They landed in Isla Mujeres. The Aztecs who were living there invited them on the land. They went in, they saw their city. They were really impressed with what they saw. They saw a lot of gold that really impressed them. So they left for a little bit. They were ambushed, but they won that battle. They took a couple hostages, and they went on around, and they stopped in a couple towns, including Campeche, where they had some more battles, and they lost. 56 Spaniards died in a battle, and they had to go back to Cuba. And one of these conquistadors who was on that trip wrote a book. You're going to meet him in just a minute. And in that book he said, when we had seen the gold and the houses of masonry, we felt content in having discovered such a country. So they were really impressed with Mexico when they arrived here. Now here's this conquistador. His name is Bernard Diaz del Castillo. He wrote a very important book. You can see The Discovery and Conquest of Mexico. And that's really where we get a lot of our information about what happened during those early days. And in that book, he said, we went forth to serve God and His Majesty, to bring light to those that dwell in darkness, and to get rich, as all men desire. So, Senor Castillo was a very truthful man in what he said. Now, there was one other expedition, but the main one is the third expedition that came from Cuba to Mexico. It was the one led by Hernando Cortez, and he landed at what we now know of as Veracruz on March the 4th in 1519. And when he got off the boat, supposedly he calls the Indians together and he reads them this ceremony of possession that the Spaniards had developed some years before. Of course, the Indians don't understand Spanish, but that doesn't make any difference. Cortez reads this thing to them, and the ceremony of possession said, God put St. Peter in charge of everything. St. Peter set up the Pope to govern everybody. The Pope gave the New World to Spain. The king says you must become vassals and Christians. If you do so, you'll be welcomed and you'll be free. And if you don't, it'll destroy your country and make you slaves, and it'll be your fault. So there's the first message to the Native Americans by the Spaniards when they showed up. Now, Cortez had 2 important people who were with him early on. They were his translators. One of them was a priest named Geronimo Aguilar. He had been shipwrecked earlier, and he was 8 years a Mayan slave. And so he knew Spanish and he knew Mayan. And he was given by the Mayans to Cortez. A Aztec princess named Malintzin, also known as Marina, or Molinchi, she was captured by the Mayans and made a slave, and so she spoke Mayan and Nahuatl, the Aztec language, and she was given to Cortez. So Cortez had these 2 people that were with him, and when a Mayan spoke, they spoke to Molinchi. She translated that into, they spoke Nahuatl to Molinchi. She translated into Mayan to Aguilar, and he translated it back to Spanish to Cortez. So that three-way communication is how Cortez talked to the Aztecs when he showed up. Now here is the route that Cortez took as he went from Veracruz to Mexico City. He first went up a little bit to this town, Cempoala. Then he moved on down to Tlaxcala. Both Cempoala, it had just been subjected by the Aztecs, so they didn't really like the Aztecs that much. Then he went to Tlaxcala, which was not yet subjected, and they were more prone to deal with Cortez. And then finally he went on into Mexico City. So here he is at the first stop. This is Cempoala. It's on the coast just up from Veracruz. And the Spaniards were treated to a fairly common ceremony that the Aztecs had, where they took captives, drug them to the top of their temple, laid them on an altar, cut their hearts out, and threw them down to the bottom of the temple and drug up another one. And so the Spaniards looked at that and were horrified by this practice that the Aztecs had. It was all over Mesoamerica at the time. Now they did capture 5 Aztecs who'd been sent from Mexico City. They sent 2 of them back to Montezuma to say what was going on and to tell them, we're Spaniards and we're coming your way. So the next stop, they went from Cempoala to Tlaxcala. This was the place that was not yet subjected by the Aztecs, but still the Tlaxcalans were dubious of these newcomers. So they had a couple of battles. Spain won both of them, and then they kind of made friends and became allies. The Tlaxcalans and the Spaniards did. At that same point in time now, Montezuma knew what was going to happen. So he'd sent some envoys, and they brought gold to give to the Spaniards. And there's a 1517 painting of Cortez meeting the envoys, and there's Malinche, she's a translator, and there's Aguilar, he's the other translator. Montezuma said he wanted to meet them, and he thought they were gods. The story was that this Quetzalcoatl, feathered serpent guy, had left Mexico sometime before, excuse me, but he promised to come back. Montezuma thought it was Quetzalcoatl coming back. He thought that's who Cortez was. And so he kind of revered him as a god. And he said, come to Mexico City, we want to meet and get acquainted. So Cortez was moving along. He came to the next town, which was Cholula, had a bunch of Tlaxcalans with him. They didn't fight originally, but Cholula was allied with Montezuma, excuse me. And so they had a plot that they were going to get the Spaniards. The Spaniards found out about that before it happened, so they attacked the city, razed the city to the ground, and there's a Aztec picture of that, raising the city to the ground. So the word goes back to Montezuma, but he still said, come on to the capital, we want to meet. And so Cortez did. On the way, he meets some messengers from Montezuma and says, wait a minute, I've changed my mind. I don't want you to come to the capital anymore, but I'm going to give you a whole lot of gold. And Cortez said, I'm sorry, we're coming anyway. And so he kept marching towards Mexico City. There are a couple of big volcanoes just outside of Mexico City, and that's a picture of them. And so when they got close, one of Cortez's soldiers climbed to the top of the smaller mountain, that's Iztaccíhuatl. He climbed to the top of that mountain and he looks down and he sees this magnificent city called Tenochtitlan. It's got huge white temples that are standing up. It's just absolutely amazing. And so Cortez goes on in then to this town again, which became later Mexico City. Here's what the town looked like when Cortez first saw it. It was that island in the middle of the lake. The lake, by the way, has since been drained, is long gone, and everything on that map is now Mexico City. But at that point in time, it was an island in the middle of the lake, and that's where the Aztec capital was, the city of Tenochtitlan. There were 450 Spaniards that were with Cortez when they got there, and they encountered 250,000 Aztecs just in that city. So you can look at the numbers were a little bit off kilter, and it's hard to imagine that in fact those Spaniards ending up winning against that many people. So here's another statement from our conquistador, Mr. Castillo. He says, "May I safely ask the kind reader to ponder a moment and say whether he thinks that any man in this world ever ventured so bold a stroke as this." He was pretty proud of what they had attempted to do. So here's a picture of the two nations meeting. There's Montezuma, there's Cortez. He's got Malinche, his translator behind him, and there's Aguilar, the other translator. And so they're meeting in Mexico City. It didn't take the Spaniards long to take over. They ended up dominating everybody for about 8 months. First they captured Montezuma, and then they got him co-opted to where he became basically a vassal of theirs and started telling his people to do everything the Spaniards told him to do. The Aztecs did not like that, and so they revolted after a bit against this whole thing. They killed Montezuma, they stoned him to death, and then they revolted and forced the Spaniards to leave Mexico City. And that leaving took place on June the 30th, 1520. The Spaniards called it La Noche Triste, the sad night. And so they're forced to leave. They're leaving the causeway. The Aztecs had done away with the bridges over the gaps in the causeways. They were out here shooting arrows at them from all sides. It was really a sad night for the Spaniards. 870 Spaniards were killed. They lost horses, they lost gunpowder, they lost cannons, they lost all their gold. They really had a hard time. Some of them made it all the way through. 100 of them stayed back in that temple back there. They stayed in the temple. Well, the Aztecs captured them, took every one of them to the top of the temple, and sacrificed all of them. So that was the end of those 100 Spaniards. But they got back to Tlaxcala, which was this friendly place, and Cortez regrouped. He got reinforced with a bunch of new Spanish soldiers that came up from Veracruz. And so they go back to Mexico City, Tenochtitlan. They established a siege for a while, and finally they actually conquered the city and captured the city and regained the city in August of 1521. The leader of the Aztecs at that time was Cuauhtémoc, who was Montezuma's son. And they captured him and killed him, and that basically completed the conquest. So after about August of 1521, at least in the Mexico City area, it's all Spain. And they promptly renamed that place Mexico City. So here's what they did within just a few years. This is the temple, the big temple in Mexico City. That became the cathedral. This is the Zocalo. You've been to Mexico City, you know the big square, the Zocalo. That area there is that area in Tenochtitlan right there. Across the way, Montezuma's house, they turned into the National Palace in Mexico, so it's there today. And on the other side of the square, this was Cortez's house. It was very well fortified, and I'm sorry, it was Montezuma's house. It was well fortified. Cortez took it over as his, and that's where they put the first mint. They established to make coins in the America from all the silver. And gradually, that area is where they allowed the merchants to set up shop, and so it's where the merchants are today in this building named after the merchants. So they started making these coins in 1538, and this is a picture of what those coins look like. it had two pillars on it, and those are representing what are known as the Pillars of Hercules. The Rock of Gibraltar is one of them, and on the other side is the other Pillar of Hercules. And that is, they're at the end of the Mediterranean, and the worldview is Spain is going out the Mediterranean, past the Pillars of Hercules, to this marvelous new world that they have just discovered. And that's the Latin phrase, PLVS, Pluribus Ultra, means and more beyond in Latin. So pretty soon they were making coins of a denomination of 8 reals, which was a dollar, a Spanish dollar. And so by the 1580s, these pieces of 8 for the Spanish silver dollar had become the world's currency, and they were legal tender in the United States until 1857. And then our own silver dollar, which was patterned after this one, took over. So when you look at our dollar sign today, those 2 vertical slashes, that's left over from the Pillars of Hercules on the first Spanish coin. There was a lot of silver that came out of Spain. They hauled it back to Spain, starting about the 1560s. There was a real target for pirates, so they rounded up these treasure ships, and they took them in 2 fleets. They had 2 routes. One of the routes came back from Spain, and it went to Veracruz and connected with Mexico. The other route came from Spain, it stopped at Cartagena, and picked up a bunch of gold that they were getting. It went to what's now the Panama Canal, where it could connect commerce with the Pacific Ocean. And then they went back, they all stopped at Havana, and then they went back to Spain. Those 2 round trips continued for over 250 years until 1790. When they got back to Spain, they went up the Guadalquivir River to Sevilla, and they unloaded in this Torre de Oro, the Tower of Gold, and that's still there today. If you go to Seville, you can see the Tower of Gold today. It didn't take them long to expand out from Mexico City. So they went north early on to the silver mines in Zacatecas. Wasn't long they got to Saltillo, to Monterrey. In 1598, they got all the way up into New Mexico and settled in Mexico. 100 years later, they came to Texas. And then in 1768, they colonized California. So that's Spain going north. They went south faster than that. They went all the way down to this peninsula by the 1540s. They had captured most of the Yucatan. They founded the city of Merida. But there were still a lot of these Mayan city-states left, and they had fights with these Mayan city-states, primarily in Guatemala, like Tikal and some others, and that continued all the way well into the 1800s before they finally subjected all of the Mayans. Now, the economy of New Spain, it's called a mercantile economy. It was all designed to benefit Spain and not to benefit Mexico. So they took all the silver that they first stole from the Aztecs and then started mining themselves. That silver went back to Spain to pay for the European wars. They also took a lot of raw materials from Spain, from Mexico, back to Spain, converted them into finished goods, and then sent those back to Mexico to sell. So it was a mercantile economy. It was tightly controlled. They had monopolies on all the stuff that people wanted: tobacco, salt, gunpowder. Pulque is like a beer. It's an alcoholic beverage. Agriculture was the mainstay, both to eat and to export. And the big exports you can see there, cochineal is a cactus bug. It lives on a cactus, and you make a red dye out of it. And it was worth a lot of money, so they exported these cactus bugs, cochineal. Cocoa was really important, cocoa beans. Vanilla, sugar, cotton, these are all New World products that were sent back to Spain. So here's what we now know as chocolate. The Aztec word is chocolate, and that's where we got chocolate from. It was a ceremonial drink. They'd been drinking it for a long time, they did not have any milk. They didn't have cows or anything else. So they didn't know what chocolate milk was. But they made a drink out of the cocoa bean that was very spicy and hot and really popular. Montezuma introduced Cortez to this drink. He said, I think it'll be a winner back in Europe. So they sent cocoa beans back to Spain. Sure enough, it became very popular. So Spain pretty soon learned about chocolate. They had milk in Europe, and it wasn't long all of the nobles in Europe were drinking chocolate milk, thanks to the Spaniards. Now here's another story that's one of my favorites. It's a story of the Virgin of Guadalupe. It's one of the main figures, religious figures in Mexico today. And the story is that there was a young Indian named Juan Diego in 1531, and he went out to this hill outside of Mexico City, and he encounters the Virgin Mary. And she said, I want you to have a church built on this hill. And so Juan goes back to the bishop, and he says, I've met this lady, and she said, a church. And the bishop says, well, how do I know you're telling me the truth? Go back and bring some kind of a sign. So he goes back, he meets the Virgin Mary again. She gives him some roses, which are out of season, and puts them in a cloak and brings them back. And Juan shows out to the bishop, and he sees it, and he says, aha, I think you're right. And he did actually go build a church back there. And that was particularly important to these Aztecs because it told them that the Virgin Mary is one of us. She's not only theirs, she's a part of ours too. And so that's a very important part of their religion, and they still call her the Queen of Mexico, if you go down there. Here are some of the questions that the Spaniards asked themselves about these Aztecs early on. Are they really human? They're not from one of the sons of Noah. Those sons populated everything we knew about. The Bible says the gospel was preached to all nations, but they didn't preach it in Mexico. They didn't preach it to the Indians. Do they have a soul? Well, how could they? If they're going to perform this kind of sacrifice, how can they be human and have a soul? So they ask themselves that question. Can they really be saved, or are they just sinners? There's nothing you can do about it. They had big debates back in Spain about those questions. And finally, in 1537, the Pope ruled on the subject, and he says, yes, 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 they're really human. They have a soul, and they can be saved. And by the way, you can't make slaves out of them, but you can come pretty close. And that's what happened. So these are the two basic economic institutions that New Spain had. One of them was called an encomienda. It's where the lands were not given, but they were commended to these certain Spaniards, and that meant that they could extract tribute from the people who lived on it. They weren't slaves, and they didn't own the land. By this process, they could make them pay tribute to them. So that was the encomienda. And the other one was repartimiento. And that meant, again, that they weren't slaves, but you could force them to work on your farms and to build buildings. So if you needed to build a building, you could go into these areas that you had commended to you and force the people to come and build your buildings. So that was the two economic institutions. In the northern part of the state were the ranches. They had cattle that went wild, were all over northern Mexico, in Texas also. They captured those cattle, they shipped the hides to Spain, and they used the meat to feed the silver miners. And so that's how they fed the people that were mining the silver. The first cowboys were Indians. We call them vaqueros. A lot of the Spanish words for ranching got into the Texas culture, and we still have them today. We call them buckaroos. That's vaquero. Lariat is from la riata, which means the rope. So that's the lariat, la riata. And then you know rodeo, remuda is a herd of horses. All these Spanish terms we've kept, and still used today in our ranching culture. Missionaries were an important part of this equation. Just a year or so after he conquered Mexico City, Cortez asked for 3 Franciscan friars to come, and they did. The other orders followed soon after that. And by 1559, there were 80 missions established in Mexico and 300 Franciscan priests, and that only grew. And there was, and I think still is, a good relationship between the priests and the Indians. The priests taught them Christianity. They laid the groundwork for how they could amalgamate the 2 cultures. The natives trusted the priests. They helped protect them from these Spanish overlords. They educated them. They taught them how to read and write. They taught them how to be farmers. They taught them arts and crafts. So it was a good relationship between the priests and the Indians throughout all of colonial Spain. Now here's a kind of a good news and a bad news story. This is Bishop Diego de Landa. He was, by the way, very much against the oppression that the Spaniards were doing to the Aztecs. And so he was working to try to make the situation a little better for the Indians, but he didn't like the books that they had. They had all these called codices. They're books that they had drawn pictures in, and he ended up burning almost all of them. And so this is his statement in July of 1562. He said, "We found a large number of books in these characters, and as they contained nothing in which were not to be seen as superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all, which caused the Mayans to regret it to an amazing degree and caused them much affliction." So they burned most of the books, but fortunately not all of them. There are maybe 6 or 8 that have survived. And we have them in various parts of the world today. Of course, we've all translated them. There's one of them called the Paris Codex, and there are several others. So we've learned a lot about the Aztecs through those 6 or 8 books that de Landa missed when he burned the rest of them. Commerce. The Gulf of Mexico was a Spanish-only sea for 100 and almost 200 years. They would not allow any other country to bring ships into the Gulf of Mexico and communicate with Spain. They lightened that a little bit in 1713 when they had a treaty in Europe. They told the English that you can send 1 ship a year into the Gulf of Mexico. You can bring 500 tons of goods and bring those to Veracruz, and we'll trade you with them. And by the way, if you want to bring in any African slaves, that's okay too. So they let 1 English ship a year come in as late as 1713. So it was a total monopoly for a long period of time. Slavery. Slavery was around for a long time in Spain. It was well established in the Caribbean islands of Hispaniola and Cuba. When they started to run out of Indians to work their mines and to do their agriculture, they started to bring in these African slaves, which were in fact real slaves. They brought those into Mexico to replace the Indians in mines and agriculture. By 1553, there were about 20,000 Africans who had been brought into Mexico. And they ended up being in 2 castes, the African Mexicans were. They had, I guess you'd call them an upper class, they were still slaves. They called them Ladinos. They lived in the cities, they spoke Spanish, they were Catholics, and they did housework, and they were artisans, things like that. And so that's the Ladinos. And then the newer ones that just came in were just used for hard labor, and they call them bozales. And that's where we get our word bozo from bozales. So slavery continued for, well, past the United States and Mexico. Here's the chart that shows the population in colonial Mexico. It started up here pretty high. You had epidemics, smallpox, the usual thing. Typhus came in, and pretty rapidly, the population just decimated. Within just a few hundred years, it dropped way down until finally you get to, it started back up again in the late 1600s. In 1793, they took a census, and there's the results of it. 61% were still Native Americans, pretty pure. 21% had already mixed. So you have a Spanish native mix called mestizo. Criollos are pure Spaniards who were born in Mexico. So there were 16% of them, and only 2% were Spaniards who were actually born in Spain. They call those peninsulares. And you can see that the Africans weren't very many, only 0.2% in that point in time. And so it is that basis in 1793 that led forward to the period that we're going to cover next week, which will start with the independence, which began in about 1810 and took about 20 years to free Mexico from Spain. You'll meet some interesting characters like Pancho Villa, and we're going to do this on December the 12th here. It'll be the second phase of this, and I promise you we're going to get to Dos Equis at that point in time. So that's the first half of Mexican history, and now I'd like to open it up for questions. Maria, do you have a
Yes,
microphone? Excuse me, anybody's got any questions? One in the back. Excuse me.
Have you ever looked into comparing the timeline for European civilization with the civilization you just discussed?
The timeline
Well,
there's a lot of similarities. I mean, they didn't have some things that they had in Europe. They didn't have horses, they didn't have cows, so they couldn't develop a cart, and so it was a little tougher. But they had civilizations like, for example, the OLMECS and the Mayans that really rivaled Europe along the same point in time.
How did the indigenous population know that gold was valuable?
It wasn't as valuable as Cortez and you and I thought it was to the Aztecs. The most valuable thing that the Aztecs had was jade. The story was that you could take a little carved piece of jade and it was worth like 10 pounds of gold. So the Aztecs valued gold. They used it in some of their temples and stuff, but it wasn't near as valuable to them as it was the Spaniards. And so they figured out pretty soon that that was something the Spaniards wanted, and they used it to trade with them.
I may have missed this early on in your talk. I may have missed this early on in your talk, but where did the name Mexico come from?
The name Mexico came from what the Aztecs called themselves, Mexica, M-E-X-I-C-A. That was their name for themselves, and that became Mexico.
How did you get into this, and what research did you do? Where did you search for your research?
I'm an avocational Texas and Mexican historian. So I got interested in the subject a number of years ago, and I've just read a lot about it because I'm interested in it.
Jim, what would be your favorite single source on Mexican history?
Probably that Diaz Castillo's book, the early part of it. Now, there are lots of books about Mexican history that go past that, and I'm not sure I can remember a favorite. I've
Something
read a
in the
bunch of
modern
them.
era,
Yeah. Yeah,
something written in the last 50 years.
I can't think of the name of one,
What
but
do you
I
think
read a
of
bunch of them.
Fehrenbach's book?
Fehrenbach wrote a good one, but there are lots of interesting books. I'm trying to think, there's one called something like Unusual Neighbors. That's not even it exactly, but it's close. It's really interesting in describing cultures, compared to cultures of what America had and has with what Mexico had and has. The two differences in cultures are pretty interesting. Right.
What did they use for power? Was it entirely with their hands, or did they have wind power or some other sources?
They only had their hands early on. There were no beasts of burden, so they didn't have oxen to pull a plow. They had to push their own plows, and they didn't have windmills or anything. So they just used basically human labor was their power for a long time. That's all they had. And then, you know, the Spaniards brought cattlemen, so it wasn't too long when they did have something to pull a plow. But early on, they did not.
So as far as, Jim, as far as the horses that they were on, they were brought over by the Spanish?
Yes, horses were originally in North and South America, but they died out about 10 to 15,000 years ago, along with the mammoth and the mastodon and the saber-toothed tiger. There were horses there too, but they died out, so there were no native horses in the Americas up until the Spaniards came, and they brought them from Europe. And that was another part of the reason why the Spaniards had a relatively easy time conquering the Aztecs. They'd never seen this big thing that a human could ride on. They didn't know what a horse was. It just mystified them. And it was just another thing that maybe told them to believe that these people are like gods because they've got all these things that we've never seen before.
Other than the horses and the shields, to what do you attribute the military superiority that such a relatively small number of soldiers could overcome a large population of natives?
Linda wants to know how it came to pass that such a small number of Spaniards could overcome that vast number of Aztecs. And there are several reasons for that. One of them is they had these things like horses, they had guns, they could shoot. The Aztecs didn't know what a gun was, they had bow and arrows. They had steel swords, and they were treated like gods. And the other fact is, a whole lot of the Aztecs were used to being subjected by somebody. Earlier on, it might have been another Aztec, but they were accustomed to being commanded by somebody else. And so it made it easier for the Spaniards to take over that role from Montezuma.
Disease. There's also disease.
Disease was an important early part. Lynn's right. Smallpox could have been in Mexico before the Spaniards came. That happened across the United States. Smallpox came to the East Coast, and it ran all the way across the country and killed off a lot of Indians before the Americans ever crossed the Appalachian Mountains. The same thing could have happened. So disease was an important reason also. They didn't have any resistance against those diseases. One more question. Here.
Could you say something more about how they drained that lake?
I'm not sure they really drained it. They just shut off the water and it filled in. And it was a lake, there's no question about that. But it's gone now, and it's been gone for quite a while. So I don't know whether they dug a canal and drained some of it or what, but the lake went away. Okay, thank you very much for coming.